The sun beat down mercilessly on Dry Creek, turning the town square into a furnace of dust and judgment. Men gathered in tight clusters, spitting tobacco and jeering like it was sport, while women in faded calico clutched their children's hands, shielding their eyes from what they knew was wrong, but dared not say aloud. In the center of it all stood Sheriff McKenna, his badge glinting like false gold, and at his side, a man bound in heavy chains, wrists rubbed raw, shoulders squared with a dignity that defied every insult hurled his way. "This here's a savage," the sheriff bellowed, his voice a mix of law and carnival bark. "Caught him stealing horses. Judge says he's to be sold. $50 to start." The crowd roared with laughter and slurs. "Beast," one man spat. "Animal," shouted another. But the man in shackles never lowered his gaze. His dark eyes swept over them with a quiet calm that unsettled more than rage ever could. He was everything they feared because he refused to break. Then, cutting through the chaos, a woman's voice rang out, sharp as a rifle crack. "Don't hurt him." The square fell silent, the tension snapping like a whip. All heads turned to see her, Clara Whitford, the widow who'd stubbornly clung to her failing ranch at the edge of town. Her brown dress was plain, her hands trembled slightly, but her green eyes burned with fire. "I'll buy him," she declared. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Clara, you've lost your mind," hissed Mrs. Patterson. "You can't bring that savage onto your land." But Clara stepped forward, pulling a cloth bundle from her purse, the sound of coins clinking louder than the murmur of outrage. $70, she said, her voice steady. "Everything I have." The sheriff's smirk faltered. The crowd seethed. And in that instant, Clara knew. This wasn't just a purchase. This was defiance, a strike against the cruelty that had ruled this dusty square for too long. And as her eyes locked with the prisoners, for the first time in years, she felt something stir within her. Purpose. The silence after Clara's words stretched like a drawn bowstring, heavy with disbelief. Dust swirled through the still air, and every eye in Dry Creek fixed on her as if she had just cursed God himself. The sheriff blinked, his mouth twitching beneath his bristled mustache. "You can't be serious," McKenna scoffed, though his voice carried less authority than before. But Clara stood tall, clutching her small bundle of coins like a weapon. $70. He's mine now." The muttering exploded into outrage. Women pressed kerchiefs to their mouths as though shielding themselves from scandal. Men spat into the dirt, shaking their heads, some with pity, most with fury. "You'll regret this, Clara," Mrs. Patterson cried, her high voice quivering. "You'll bring shame to us all." Shouts echoed. "She's lost her mind." "That's no man, that's a beast." "She'll get herself killed." The square had transformed from a place of trade into a pit of snarling wolves. But Clara's eyes never wavered from the chained man. Savage, they called him, yet she saw the strength in his stillness, the silent defiance in his gaze. And something deeper, a weariness carved by cruelty but not conquered by it. McKenna, reddening with embarrassment, snatched the bundle from her hands and counted, hoping for a mistake. $70, true. He cursed under his breath. With no choice, he unlocked the shackles from the man's ankles but left the wrist irons. "Take him then," he growled, spitting in the dirt. "But don't come crying when he guts you in your sleep." A ripple of ugly laughter followed his words, yet Clara did not flinch. She turned to the prisoner, her voice lowering, soft yet steady. "Come with me." The man's dark eyes held hers for a long moment. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to strike, to spit, to curse. Instead, he inclined his head, dignity in chains, and stepped forward beside her. Gasps, shock, rage. Mothers yanked children closer. Men gripped the butts of their pistols, torn between fear and loathing. And together, Clara and the man began walking through the parted crowd. The townsfolk recoiled as though the pair carried plague. Disgust twisted their faces. "Shame on you, Clara," someone hissed. "An abomination," shouted another. But Clara's jaw was granite, her spine unbroken. At the edge of the square, Mrs. Patterson's voice rose shrill above the din. "Mark my words, Clara Whitford, you'll pay for this folly." Clara didn't turn. Instead, She threw her words back like thunder. The only thing I'd regret is standing by while you treat a man like livestock. The audacity of it stunned them. For years, Dry Creek had been ruled by unspoken law. Keep quiet, keep in line, and never question the way things were. But in one act, Clara had shattered it. As they walked, the weight of judgment pressed on Clara's shoulders. She could feel the stares like hot irons on her back. Yet with every step, she also felt the man's presence beside her, calm, solid, a silent wall against the tide of hatred. By the time they reached the sheriff's office for the bill of sale, her hands were trembling. Not from fear, but from the enormity of what she'd done. She had not only purchased a man's freedom, she had declared war on the hypocrisy of her town. McKenna scrawled the bill with sour reluctance. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "Lord knows you will." "Then may the Lord help me," Clara said, snatching the paper, "because this town won't." When she turned, the man followed without hesitation. Outside, whispers snaked through the streets. A few townsfolk trailed them at a distance, as if watching a sideshow. Clara's heart pounded. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. And she knew Dry Creek. This wasn't a town that forgave. Already she could imagine the whispers spreading like wildfire, over supper tables in the church pews, across saloon counters slick with whiskey. By nightfall, her name would be spat with the same venom they reserved for outlaws. She glanced at the man walking beside her, the chains at his wrists clinking with each step. He moved with silent grace, ignoring the stares, ignoring the jeers. Clara realized then that she had not only bought him, she had tied her fate to his. If he fell, she would fall too. By the time they reached the edge of town, Clara's resolve hardened. She heard the voice of old Samuel Turner, the blacksmith, shaking his head. "That woman's gonna get herself killed. Them savages can't be civilized." But another voice followed. Softer, almost defiant. Young Tom Bradley, the doctor's son. "Maybe it's not his nature that needs civilizing. Maybe it's ours." His father cuffed him sharply across the ear for speaking, but Clara heard the words. They were a seed, small and fragile, but alive. And as she and the man disappeared into the dusty horizon, the crowd still buzzing with outrage, Clara knew one truth above all. This was only the beginning. The battle had just begun. In the Wild West, standing against injustice meant risking everything. Your land, your life, your name. Clara dared to defy her entire town with nothing but $70, a stubborn heart, and the belief that one man was worth saving. What would you have done in her place? If this story gripped you, hit like to show your support. Don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West tales of courage and defiance, and share this with a friend, because stories like this deserve to be remembered, told, and felt. The road out of Dry Creek stretched long and silent, the only sound the creak of leather saddles and the steady clop of hooves. Clara gripped the reins tighter than she needed to, her pulse still hammering from the storm she had just unleashed. Behind them, the town buzzed like a hornet's nest kicked open, the sting of words, shame, madwoman, savage lover, still ringing in her ears. Beside her, the man rode the borrowed mare with a stillness that unnerved her. His wrists were still bound in iron, the chains clinking softly with every stride. Yet he sat tall, shoulders squared, his gaze scanning the horizon as if danger might leap from the grass itself. Clara could not decide what frightened her more, the hostility of the town behind them or the unreadable silence of the man beside her. They crested a hill, and the Whitford Ranch came into view. Even in the forgiving light of late afternoon, there was no hiding what it had become. The house leaned slightly east, boards weathered gray and splintered. Half the fence posts along the pasture sagged in surrender, leaving gaps wide enough for cattle to wander, if she still had cattle. The barn roof was patched with tar paper and mismatched shingles, more hope than structure. It was not the home she and Jacob had once dreamed of. It was a ghost of that dream, bleached by sun, wind, and years of grief. Clara braced herself for his judgment, but when she dared a glance, the man simply surveyed the ranch with sharp eyes and gave the smallest of nods, as though he had seen worse. Relief and shame tangled in her chest. It wasn't always like this, she heard herself say, then wished she hadn't. Why did it matter what he thought? He gave no reply, only dismounted with the silent grace of someone accustomed to making do with less. Clara led the horse toward the barn, pushing open the warped doors. The smell of dust and old hay rose around them. Inside, she found blankets folded in a trunk by the door. "You can sleep here," she said briskly, not meeting his eyes. "There's hay in the loft. I'll bring supper when it's ready." For a moment, he stood motionless by the doorway, the chains at his wrists glinting in the dim light. When she finally turned, she found him not watching her, but staring at the lone photograph on the mantelpiece, Jacob frozen at 28, smiling with plans that would never be fulfilled. "My husband," Clara said quietly. "Jacob. Fever took him 3 winters ago." The man nodded slowly. His eyes lingered on the photograph for a long moment before he turned and stepped back into the barn. Just before leaving, his lips parted. The word came rough, rusty from disuse. "Thank you." It startled her more than if he'd shouted. Clara pressed a hand to her chest as he disappeared into the dusk. Supper was simple: beans, cornbread, the last preserved peaches from 2 summers ago. When she brought the tray to the barn, she found him sitting on a bale of hay, mending a broken harness buckle with surprising skill. She hesitated. "You don't have to." He looked up, eyes glinting with the faintest trace of amusement. Clara set the tray down and managed a wry smile. "Well, I suppose there's plenty here that needs fixing." They ate in silence, broken only by the curious mews of barn cats. One bold tabby rubbed against his leg. To Clara's astonishment, his hand fell to stroke the animal with a gentleness that seemed to crack the hard shell the town had placed around him. That night, Clara lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the familiar groans of the old house, but beneath those sounds was something new, the faint presence of another life on the ranch. For the first time in 3 years, she was not entirely alone. It should have frightened her. Everyone in town certainly expected her to be terrified. Yet, staring at the shadows across her ceiling, Clara felt something she couldn't name. Not peace exactly, but perhaps the fragile outline of it. Morning came with a long list of chores. Clara stood at her table, pencil scratching, roof leaks in 3 places, the well pump leather worn thin, chicken coop hole letting foxes in, garden fence weak against rabbits. The list seemed endless. She rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of futility pressing in. A soft knock startled her. She opened the door to find him there, hair tied back, still wearing yesterday's torn clothes, but standing more settled than before. He gestured toward the barn, then to himself, then mimed swinging a hammer. "You want to work?" she asked. He nodded once. "I can't pay you," she admitted. "Food and shelter, that's all I can offer. I spent everything I had just to—" She stopped, her cheeks hot. He lifted his hands, palms raw and scarred from shackles, then pointed to the house, then to her. And he nodded again. Clara blinked back sudden tears. "Then we'd better get started." By midday, the rhythmic clang of hammer on wood rang across the valley. Clara fed the chickens, pulled weeds in the garden, but her attention kept straying. He had started with the fence. Posts that had sagged drunkenly for years now stood straight and sure. His movements were efficient, purposeful, as though every blow of the hammer was a refusal to remain broken. When she brought water, he drank deeply, then surprised her by speaking. "Good tools," he said, nodding toward the shed. "Jacob was particular about his tools," Clara replied, her voice catching. "Said a man's only as good as what he works with." The man considered this, then gave a rare approving nod. "Wise." The single word carried more weight than a sermon. That evening, Clara insisted he eat inside. She found herself talking about Jacob, about the ranch, about her family back east who'd begged her to sell and return. She expected indifference, but his attention never wavered. When her words faltered, he spoke softly, haltingly, of land that remembers both good times and bad, waiting for hands that care. Clara's throat tightened. This man, whom they had called savage, spoke with more truth in a few words than the entire town did in a year. Days turned into a week, then 2. A routine emerged. He worked from dawn to dusk, mending, rebuilding, reclaiming. She tended to the garden, the animals, the meals. In the evenings, they ate together, sometimes with words, often in silence that no longer felt empty. The ranch began to change, subtle at first, then undeniable. Fences straightened. The barn door no longer sagged. The well pump creaked but gave clear water. Even the chickens laid more eggs, as if responding to the new energy. But Clara knew this fragile peace would not last. Every nail he drove, every beam he raised, every moment they shared. It was building something. Not just a ranch. Something the town of Dry Creek would not tolerate. And as the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, painting the land in blood-red light, Clara looked across the table at him, at the quiet strength in his posture, the flicker of humanity in his dark eyes, and a shiver ran through her. She had bought his freedom, but in doing so, she had declared war. The days had begun to flow with rhythm, hammer against wood, Clara's quiet hums as she worked the garden, the low crackle of fire at night. The ranch was no longer silent. It breathed again. Yet beneath the surface, Clara felt a tension coiling, waiting. She had lived long enough in Dry Creek to know peace was a luxury the town would not allow her. The warning came not in words, but in sound. Late one afternoon, as Clara weeded the rows of beans, she heard the distant thunder of hooves. At first faint, then growing. 3, maybe 4 riders. She straightened slowly, her pulse quickening. The sun was sinking behind the hills, staining the sky in bruised shades of red and purple. It felt like an omen. She gripped the hoe tighter, but forced herself to keep her movements calm, her posture steady. Samuel appeared from behind the barn, eyes narrowed, his body tense as a drawn bow. Without a word, he set down the hammer he had been using and walked toward her, the weight of his presence a silent shield. The riders crested the hill and came into view. Dale Morrison, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, flanked by the Harmon brothers. Drunken, mean-spirited men whose cruelty was as legendary as their tempers. And beside them, Sheriff McKenna, his face tight with unease. Clara's stomach clenched. If the law rode in with them, whatever happened next would not be simple intimidation. The horses halted at her gate, dust rising around them like smoke. Morrison dismounted first, his boots crunching on the dry earth. His smile was thin, practiced, a predator baring teeth. "Clara Whitford," he said smoothly. "We've come to check on your welfare." Clara straightened, her voice cold steel. "As you can see, I'm perfectly well." Morrison's eyes flicked past her to Samuel, who stood just behind her shoulder, silent but radiating defiance. The rancher's expression darkened. Can't blame folks for being concerned. A woman alone, with him. He spat the word like poison. "His name is Samuel," Clara snapped. "And I'm not alone, as you've just pointed out." The Harmon brothers laughed crudely, their hands hovering near their pistols. McKenna shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "You've taken leave of your senses, Clara," Morrison said, stepping closer. His shadow fell long across the garden's soil. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'll make you an offer. Sell me this land. I'll take that creature off your hands and spare you the shame of what people are saying." "My land is not for sale," Clara said evenly. "Everything's for sale," Morrison pressed, his voice tightening. "It's just a matter of price." Clara's heart hammered, but her voice dropped to something dangerous, deliberate. "Get off my property." The air seemed to thicken, charged with the crackle of an unseen storm. Morrison's jaw worked. The Harmons shifted again, eyes glittering with menace. And then Samuel stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The hammer he carried hung loose at his side, catching the fading sunlight. His stance was calm but unyielding, a wall between Clara and the men who threatened her. The Harmons' hands twitched toward their guns. Clara's breath caught. If steel was drawn, blood would spill in her garden. But before they could act, McKenna barked, "Hold!" His voice cracked with strain, but it cut through the tension. "The ladies asked you to leave," the sheriff said, his eyes darting between Samuel and Morrison. Something in his face had shifted. Shame, perhaps, or the weight of the law he could not twist to suit them. "And the law says her land's her own. We've no right here." Morrison turned on him, face flushed with fury. "You're siding with that?" "I'm siding with the law," McKenna shot back, though his voice faltered. For a long moment, the standoff teetered on the edge of violence. Then Morrison hissed through clenched teeth, mounted his horse, and spat into the dust. "This isn't over, Clara. When that savage shows his true nature, and he will, you'll come begging for help. Don't expect decent folk to save you." The Harmon brothers chuckled darkly as they turned their horses. The small company rode off, leaving a trail of dust and threats hanging in the evening air. Only when the hoofbeats faded did Clara's knees weaken. She might have fallen if Samuel hadn't steadied her with a hand at her elbow, gentle, careful, as if he feared breaking something fragile. "Thank you," she whispered. Samuel shook his head. His voice was low, steady. "You stand for me. I stand for you." The simplicity of the words struck deeper than any grand vow. Clara felt the truth of it settle in her bones. That night, Clara couldn't bring herself to send him back to the barn. She stood in the kitchen, her hands twisting in her apron, before finally blurting, "There's a room off the kitchen. It's empty. You'd be closer if—" She trailed off, flustered. Samuel understood. He gave a single nod, no triumph in his expression, only quiet acceptance. That night, for the first time since Jacob's death, Clara slept with someone else under her roof. Not a hired hand, not a neighbor passing through, someone who had stood at her side, hammer in hand, against the world. Yet sleep was thin, haunted. Clara dreamed of torches in the night, of men riding through her gate with fire and guns. She woke before dawn, Jacob's old shotgun heavy in her hands. She cleaned it by lamplight, her fingers trembling only slightly. When Samuel saw it leaning by the door the next morning, he simply nodded, as if to say, "Good. Be ready." The ranch seemed different after that evening. The fragile rhythm they had built was shadowed by the memory of Morrison's words. Every creak of the fence, every distant hoofbeat made Clara's pulse spike. She found herself glancing often at the horizon, expecting riders. Samuel moved differently too, still working tirelessly, but never far from reach, his eyes scanning the distance with the wariness of a man who had learned danger could come from anywhere. And though the fences rose straighter, though the well pumped cleaner water, though the chickens laid more eggs, Clara felt it. A storm was coming. She did not know when, she did not know how, but she knew with every beat of her heart that the ranch was no longer just a battlefield of weeds and broken boards. It was a battlefield of survival, of defiance. And the next time Morrison came, he would not come to bargain. He would come to claim. The uneasy quiet after Morrison's departure stretched for days, but it was not peace. It was the fragile silence before a storm. Clara felt it in the pit of her stomach. Every creak of wood, every distant hoofbeat sent her heart pounding. Samuel felt it too. She saw it in the way his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon, in the hammer he wore at his belt even when he wasn't working. The ranch carried on. Fences rose straighter, the barn door no longer sagged, and the well gave water more freely. Yet every repair seemed like defiance, every nail struck into timber a challenge thrown at the town's hatred. Clara knew Morrison wouldn't let this stand. The first sign came before dawn. Clara woke to the sound of horses, more than one, their hooves pounding in the dirt like war drums. She sat upright in bed, her hand instinctively reaching for Jacob's shotgun by the door. Her breath caught when she saw Samuel already at the window, shoulders rigid, eyes reflecting the faint torchlight flickering in the yard. "They're here," Clara whispered. Samuel turned, his face set like carved stone. "We stand together," he said, echoing the words he'd given her days before. Clara forced herself to breathe, steady and deliberate. She stepped onto the porch with the shotgun cradled in her arms. Samuel followed, just behind her shoulder, silent but unshakable. 6 riders fanned out in her yard. The Harmon brothers sat their horses like wolves, scenting blood. Behind them, Reverend Blackwood's long black coat made him look like a crow perched for carrion. And at their center rode Ray Hutchkins, Morrison's foreman, a cruel grin plastered across his face. "Mrs. Whitford," Blackwood called, his voice heavy with false piety, "we've come to talk sense into you. It's not fitting for a woman to keep company with a savage. You're bringing shame on this town and danger to yourself. Clara's voice cracked like a whip in the dawn air. Strange hour to call on a woman, Reverend, carrying torches. Looks more like a lynch mob than a church call. The men shifted uneasily, but Hutchkins barked a laugh. You can dress it up however you want. Fact is, we're not leaving till that Indian is gone. Samuel stepped forward then, his shadow long across the dirt. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence was a wall they could not ignore. See? Blackwood pointed, his voice rising theatrically. Threatening good Christian men. Proof of what he is. Clara lifted the shotgun, not aiming but making her intent unmistakable. The only threat here, she said, her voice steady, comes from men who ride into my yard with fire in their hands. You've had your say. Now leave. For a heartbeat, the night seemed ready to explode. The Harmons twitched toward their pistols. Samuel's jaw tightened, his body coiled. Clara thought the air itself might ignite. Then Hutchkins spat into the dust. This ain't over. Morrison's got plans for this land. When that savage turns on you, don't expect anyone to help. He wheeled his horse, the others following, leaving the stink of smoke and threat behind them. But not before one of the Harmon brothers hurled his torch toward the barn. Clara gasped. But Samuel moved faster than she thought possible. He stamped out the flame before it caught the dry wood, the fire snuffed beneath his boot. For a long moment, Clara could only stare at him, her chest tight with both terror and gratitude. When the hoofbeats faded into the distance, the silence was suffocating. Clara lowered the shotgun, her hands trembling. Samuel stood beside her, breathing hard, his dark eyes unreadable. You spoke strong, he said quietly. True words. Clara's throat felt raw. Didn't stop them. They'll be back. Yes, Samuel admitted. But not tonight. The hours that followed felt heavier than any day of labor. Clara walked the fences with Samuel, searching for signs of sabotage. They found none, but both knew the riders would return. Morrison's pride was a wound, and men like him didn't let wounds heal quietly. That evening, Clara unlocked a small box she hadn't touched in 3 years. Inside lay Jacob's Colt revolver, polished and waiting. She carried it to the table where Samuel sat mending a harness. This was my husband's, she said, unwrapping it in oiled cloth. I want you to have it. Samuel stared at the weapon, then at her. You trust me with this? I trust you with my life, Clara replied simply. His hands closed around the revolver with reverence, testing its weight, the click of its action sharp in the quiet room. I will not dishonor this gift, he said solemnly. Clara held his gaze. I know. 2 nights later, smoke rose on the horizon. Clara and Samuel raced toward it. Paul Garrett's farm, their neighbors to the east, was ablaze. People were already gathered, shouting, forming a frantic bucket line. Amid the chaos came Martha Garrett's scream. The children! Emma's still in the loft. Paul Garrett lunged for the burning barn, held back by men who knew he'd never come out alive. Clara's heart froze. Before she could think, Samuel was running, his body a blur against the firelit night. Samuel, she cried, but he was already gone, swallowed by smoke. The barn groaned, flames eating its bones. A moment's silence then, through the choking haze, Samuel emerged, carrying a small figure clutched against his chest. Emma Garrett coughed and sobbed, alive. The crowd erupted. Martha fell to her knees, clutching her child, her voice breaking with gratitude. Paul Garrett's face crumpled, the weight of his prejudice collapsing in the space of one breath. I was wrong, he choked. God forgive me, I was wrong. Sheriff McKenna, who had once warned Clara she'd be gutted in her sleep, stepped forward with a face stripped of arrogance. That was a brave thing you did, he said gruffly. Samuel's reply was simple, steady. Child needed help. For the first time, the town of Dry Creek stood not as judge, but as witness. The man they had mocked, chained, and spat upon had saved one of their own. Clara watched them all. Morrison's allies, Mrs. Patterson, even Reverend Blackwood, struggle with the truth. And she realized something deeper than fear was spreading through them now. Shame. That night, as the flames died and the Garretts clung to their child, Clara stood beside Samuel in the glow of embers. Their ranch still stood, their enemies still plotted, but something had shifted. In saving Emma, Samuel had forced the town to see him, not as savage, not as beast, but as a man. And Clara knew then. They had crossed a line no fire could erase. What do you see when you look at this story? A ranch on the brink, a widow's stubborn defiance, a man once chained now carrying a child from the fire. If this tale gripped you, hit like to keep these stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West tales of defiance, courage, and redemption, and share this with others, because stories of justice and hope should never burn to ash. The fire at the Garrett farm marked more than the saving of a child. It marked the rebirth of something Dry Creek had long buried, the truth that dignity cannot be chained, nor courage silenced. Clara, once a widow bound by grief, had stood against her town, her enemies, and her own fears. Samuel, once sold like an animal, had risen through smoke and flame to show the strength of his humanity. Together, they had carved a fragile but unyielding alliance in the dust of the frontier, one built not on fear or prejudice, but on respect, sacrifice, and defiance. The town might whisper, Morrison might scheme, hatred might ride again, but Clara and Samuel had already won something greater than land or safety. They had won the right to be seen. And in that hard-won recognition lay the promise of a future worth fighting for.